Hi, everyone. This is Christina McGleam, Deputy Commissioner at the City of Chicago's Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities.
Hello, I'm Lauren Huberman, Director of the MOPD Career Center. Welcome to All Access.
Thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to be coming to you from our Central West Community Center, which is located on the near west side of Chicago at 2102 West Ogden. This episode in July, we will get to celebrate the 33rd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're excited to be here at Central West because this building in 1987 was dedicated by Mayor Harold Washington, and his administration and his time as mayor was really spent towards equity and serving those populations that have been traditionally underserved. So we think it's only fitting that we would celebrate the 33rd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act here at Central West.
As Christina said, we are excited. Our July episode is going to be centered around the ADA. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law by George H.W. Bush on July 26, 1990. It prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities and provides civil rights protections in all areas of public life. So when we think about these areas of public life, this could include employment, education, transportation, as well as physical and communication access.
I now lift my pen to sign this Americans with Disability Act and say, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. God bless you all.
One important stat that we found that we share in a lot of our disability awareness and etiquette trainings is around just how prevalent disability is. In the United States, there are 61 million people in the U.S. that have a disability. That's 1 in 4 people. And then it's just important to point out that a lot of those disabilities, at least 20% of them, are invisible. So you may be interacting with someone with a disability and not even know it. And that's why this law is so significant, as it really impacts so many people.
As we commemorate the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I think it's really important to recognize that this wasn't just signed into law on July 26, 1990. And I think that a lot of work went into getting this law passed. And so this was a quote written by Arlene Meyerson, who works for the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. And she wrote, quote, "The ADA owes its birthright not to any one person or any few, but to the many thousands of people who make up the disability rights movement. People who have worked for years organizing and attending protests, licking envelopes, sending out alerts, drafting legislation, speaking, testifying, negotiating, lobbying, filing lawsuits, being arrested, doing whatever they could for a cause they believed in." So I think as Christina and I are talking today about the ADA on this podcast, that's something that we really want to recognize is it's not possible to share all the stories of those who fought for the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act and all of those who were part of this civil rights movement. But we do want to recognize how the hard work of thousands of people continues to impact the lives of the individuals that we're talking with today and really impacts everyone in this country.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear from others in the community about how the ADA has impacted their life, how it has made Chicago a more inclusive place for them to work, for them to live, for them to play, for them to really enjoy all the great things that our city has to offer. And I know that, we'll learn a lot from the things that we hear today. Thank you for joining us, Commissioner. It's great to have you here today. In our July episode, we're focusing on the ADA and the impacts that it has made in the disability community at large, as well as personally. And we're really excited to hear from you, especially in how the ADA has impacted your life.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's great to be here with you and to have some time to reflect on the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which happened now 33 years ago. So the ADA was passed on July 26, 1990, and I happened to be in Washington, D.C. at the same time that the ADA was signed into law. I was in town for a conference with my family, and I heard that this law, this civil rights law, was being passed at the White House, and I'll be honest, at the time I didn't really understand what it meant that people with disabilities would be given civil rights. Then I did not understand also that we did not previously have civil rights. So I think I thought about that as a 13-year-old, that because I had a disability, I didn't have the same rights, but the ADA gave us all of those civil rights and protections in it impacts every single area of our life. And as the ADA impact increased, I saw that impact in my education. When I went up to college, I had full access in my college education at the University of Michigan. That experience of having full access gave me new confidence and allowed me to develop my leadership skills rather than fighting for access all the time. That has really made all the difference in my trajectory. The fact that we have more people with disabilities in different professions. We have doctors with disabilities, lawyers with disabilities, like myself, and we are representing interests about every single profession. The ADA has absolutely impacted my life. Don't just listen to me when you hear the other stories today about the impact of the ADA.
ADA has always been a part of my life. I identify as someone with a disability. I have been diagnosed with arthritic rheumatic since I was born. Being in high school and still being in college, a really big part of my life has been my IEP and having that accessibility as a student. It's always made me feel a lot more connected with my education, and has also made me feel more inclusive towards gaining a further education. It has made me feel a lot more supportive as well. And it has definitely made me want to give the same type of resources back to the community. So that's a really big drive for me as a community organizer.
I am a disabled veteran, so ADA does apply to me in my personal life. There's been a very proactive effort to allow people the space to bring up their disabilities so that they could be properly addressed.
We're very excited to have you with us, Mike. Mike Ervin is a writer and disability rights activist living in Chicago. He graduated from Southern Illinois University with a journalism degree in 1978. Mike was also involved in the organization ADAPT that led the protests and filed lawsuits against the Chicago Transit Authority to make the CTA accessible for wheelchair users. And the complaint that was filed against the CTA was for not providing wheelchair lifts on buses. This effort, the protests, as well as the lawsuit, resulted in the CTA making their buses wheelchair accessible and building the momentum that eventually led to the passage of the ADA in 1990. Aside from being a disability rights activist, Mike is also a playwright and a writer. And in 1992, he started the Victory Gardens Access Project, which is a collective of disabled actors and playwrights all looking to get the disabled story on Chicago theater stages. We are very excited to have you here today, and welcome, and thank you for joining us for the All Access podcast.
All right. Well, glad to be here.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Thanks for being here, and thanks, Lauren, for that great introduction. When Lauren and I were talking about things we wanted to talk to you about today, we first just thought it makes sense to start with having you give us a little information or telling us some background about your disability and your role in the disability rights movement, especially here in the city of Chicago.
Okay. Well, I'm a native Chicagoan. I was born in Germany because my father was in the U.S. Army, but my family moved to Chicago when I was about 1 year old, and we lived on the southwest side by Midway Airport. I went to a segregated school for disabled kids called Christopher School. It's still there, around 51st and Western. And then I went to other places and ended up at Southern Illinois University. I am the third of three kids that all have the same disability. It's a form of muscular dystrophy. At the time, they called it muscular dystrophy, but since then it's been identified as spinal muscular atrophy, I guess. I just assume that's what I have. It seems to fit, but it doesn't matter. There's not much you can do about it. But I was always good at advocating for myself. And then one day it just occurred to me, I'd been reading a book called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. It was about organizing, and I never knew that there was such a thing called community organizing. And I was reading that, and at the same time, this group called ADAPT was popping up in Denver, Colorado, and they were fighting for access through buses. And I lived on a main street where a bus passed my home every day, and I felt kind of stupid that it never occurred to me that I had a right to ride that bus, that it was a public facility just like City Hall, and for it to be inaccessible was as outrageous as City Hall being inaccessible. Some people in Chicago were starting to form an ADAPT chapter, and I helped them out because I thought this is more systemic advocacy. This isn't just advocating for myself. I'm getting what I want and what I need, but it's a tougher hoe to do it on a systemic level, but when you win big, and you tend to create lasting change rather than just getting a ride today and having to go out and fight for another one tomorrow.
Can you tell us what ADAPT stands for?
At the time, it stood for American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, but once that became a reality, accessible public transit, ADAPT switched its emphasis to in-home supports, to where people, if they don't want to live in a nursing home and want to live at home, should be able to get public funding to hire people to help them in their home. And thus the acronym then became, I thought it was a stretch, I didn't care for it much, but people called it American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today. And now it's just called ADAPT. So,
Keeping it short.
Yeah. Just following the reputation that it has.
And that's what I had read too, like that there was a school that was just down the street, just a few blocks away from you, but instead you had to ride 12 miles to get to this other school.
Yeah, it was about 12 miles round trip, And, I think that particular school wasn't such a bad place. I'm glad that people have more choice now. They don't have to go to some place like that if they don't want to.
How did that experience change for you when you went to college? And I know that, you majored in journalism. Did you have intentions of, using that skill as a journalist to be an advocate?
Not really, but later when I started to really take off and develop a voice, I realized that there are a lot of endless number of stories to tell from that angle, and that they weren't just of interest to people that live them. They are of interest, but the thing is, almost everybody lives them anyway, because almost everybody either is disabled or is close to somebody who is. Right. And so the stories resonate anyway. But I didn't really think I'm going to write all these disability stories and plays and everything like that. But I knew I wanted to be a writer because there was a journalist in town named Mike Ervin, and he wrote for the Sun-Times and the Tribune and the Daily News. And I love this style. I thought he was very funny, very sarcastic, and good smartass. And I thought, I'd like to do that when I grow up. I'd like to be paid to be a smartass. But I never changed my mind. So.
And that's the name of your blog.
Right, Smartass Crippled.
Not very PC.
No, it's intended
to.
If you read the first piece, it's intended to cause you conflict because I say everybody loves a cripple, but everybody hates a smartass, and that's fine.
Can you tell us a little bit about the protest that adapted with the CTA and all the different, there was a lot of strategies involved in that.
Yeah, sure. The Chicago chapter formed on April 4th, 1984. We had our first action. And there had been some people that had gone to a national ADAPT action before that. I was not one of them. And came back and they were talking like Marco Polo, like the streets are paved with gold in Denver. They have lifts on buses. And we had zero here at the time. There was not one accessible bus in Chicago. And to this day, I have what I call green bus nightmares, where the buses at the time, now they were red, white, and blue, but they were two-tone green at the time. And I have a nightmare every once in a while where I'm out on the street and a big green bus goes by, and I go, damn it, they're not supposed to be out here anymore. It's like, and then I wake up and realize it was just a nightmare. At the time, there was no accessible buses, and maybe a dozen accessible L stops around the city, and those were by accident because they were just happened to have elevators or ramps or something. There was a lawsuit going around at the time in the Illinois Department of Human Rights Relations. I guess I can't call it rights, that's a dirty word, but you can call it relations. But Illinois Department of Human Relations, there was a lawsuit filed, and we worked with some really great lawyers who really did an excellent job of representing us, and we eventually won. But in the meantime, we decided that we didn't really trust the courts because you can have excellent lawyers and do a good job and still lose, because it all comes down to what a judge thinks. Some judges are just jerks, like everybody. There's nothing about being a judge that makes you any different from any other human being. And so we decided we'd do protests too. And even though the lawyers weren't happy about it, they went along with it. We targeted the CTA board because they're the ones who decide. And there are 7 members of the CTA board. 4 are appointed by the mayor and 3 are appointed by the governor. And it took 4 yes votes to get them to vote to make buses accessible. So we just did things like we went to their meetings and we brought noisemakers and bullhorns and we'd yell and scream and wouldn't let their meetings go on and things like that. The head of the CTA at the time, his name is Michael Cardilli, and we felt he was like a bureaucrat out of central casting. Like, he literally smoked cigars and wore a pinky ring and expensive suits and everything. And we all put on name tags that said, my name is Cardilli, and we took fake cigars and we mocked his every move. And he got really upset and walked out and things like that. But eventually we blocked buses on the streets. If an inaccessible bus pulled up, we would just surround it, not let it move, and then people get carried up the stairs and things like that. So we did what we could to dramatize it, and sometimes we got arrested. Eventually, in 1988, Judge Patricia Patton ruled in our favor, and it was a top story. It was a front page story in the Tribune, and on page 3 of the Sun-Times, there was a full page story about how we had won our lawsuit, and we feel like if we hadn't done the protest, because that's what was getting all the attention, that the story might have been on page 25 or something. And so we felt that it had all worked out really well.
Yeah. Did you ever get arrested?
I did, yes. I've been arrested nationally about a dozen times with national actions, and in Chicago about 3 or 4 times. But it's all stuff I'm proud of. I've never stolen a car or anything. It's always been for protesting.
Yeah. Different. Yeah.
It's a good kind of arrest.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. That is so impressive, too, that you all came together, like a group of you, and coordinated and implemented all these different strategies, and it worked.
Basically, we didn't want to take no for an answer. And there were interesting developments along the way. One was that Harold Washington got elected mayor, and then he appointed a man in a wheelchair, a good friend and activist named Jim Charlton, to be on the CTA board. So we had Jim working the inside on the CTA board. And eventually, when they came to both 6-1 to install lifts, when he was appointed, it was 1-6. And then it changed to 6-1. So,
Wow, no way. That's a huge swing.
It is, yeah. That was all his politicking the inside.
Yeah.
Was it really? Huh.
With the help from the outside pressure, but yeah.
And isn't it wild to think that was so controversial?
It was. I know. I look now and I think I see a ramp coming out, and someone just rolls around, and I just say, "You're welcome."
Yeah.
And I wonder if they have any idea what it took to get that to happen.
Do you remember it taking a really long time for all the buses to be accessible?
Yeah. Eventually, we had to sign an agreement to phase them in.
Okay.
And also the agreement was based on new buses, not putting lifts on old buses.
Yeah.
The original demand was don't order any more buses that don't have lifts on them. That was what we said, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to keep ordering inaccessible buses. So we stopped them with legal maneuvers and things like that. And then when the judge ruled in our favor, the CTA just gave up and said, all right, you win, and that was it. So
Did ADAPT have a role in any of the other accessibility features on like public transit?
Well, our demands had always included the comprehensive picture like you see in the ADA, with the stops being called out for blind people and the stuff that deaf people benefit from, the visual displays and things like that. So it was always very comprehensive, even though our main interests and our main activists were wheelchair users, and we started with that. It's got to be the full package. We wouldn't have settled for just wheelchair lifts.
30 years ago this day, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks desegregated the bus system down there. We're going to stop the segregation that we've got here in Chicago.
Other movements like the civil rights movement and just other uprisings of civil disobedience showed us that that works, and we felt there was a missing element in what was happening, and that the only way this really serious problem was going to end is if we did something like that. We didn't necessarily enjoy having to do it. We enjoyed winning, but it would have been fine with me had we never had to do anything like that. I would have preferred doing something else, but it had to be done, and it was for our own self-interest, too. We wanted to get around. And there's limits to persuasion. We felt like we could convince these guys all day long that they were doing something wrong, and they knew they were doing something wrong. They didn't care. And the only way they were going to do it right is to make them do it. So we felt like just sitting there convincing and trying to reason with them was never going to work, and that we just had to make them do it whether they liked it or not. So I don't know whether they liked it, but they did it. So
Do you still think that that is the best way to have change happen?
I think so. I think sometimes that's what it takes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And I think that too often when we realize that that's what it takes, we back off. Some people you can convince, and some people you can sue and they'll listen to it, and sometimes things work. But sometimes you just run into people that aren't going to change unless you make them change.
So, we said it's been almost 33 years since the ADA has been passed.
Right.
What do you think are the biggest, areas of improvement that we've made, and what work do you think we still have to do?
Well, like I said, I think with public transit, the change is enormous. If you look at even 20 years ago, but especially 35, 40 years ago, like in the 80s and 70s, compared to today. I mean, sometimes I hear people say the ADA hasn't done anything, and I just have to laugh. But, you must not live where I live, where I can just look out the window and see a bus go by. That kind of thing, infrastructure, especially in urban areas, has improved a lot. I think there's more of an assumption that you will be included. There used to be an assumption that you would be excluded, and I think there is more of an assumption now that you will be included. But it's obviously made a huge difference, and there's no turning back.
Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for all the work you've done and you continue to do.
All right. Well, thank you for helping us talk about it, letting people know.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today and coming down to City Hall in the recording studio. It's great to be here with you in person, and we really appreciate your time and your wisdom and you sharing your story with us.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on our All Access podcast. I'm Christina McGleam, your co-host.
And I'm Lauren Huberman, your other co-host.
Our executive producer is Commissioner Rachel Arfa.
And we also want to thank Gerardo and John at City Hall, who are our technical advisors and editors. So thank you very much. And of course, we want to thank our guest.
As well as a special thank you to our American Sign Language interpreter who helps to make our podcast accessible, Esteban Amaro.
Thank you.